We've got a great fun this afternoon, or whenever you are listening and viewing this podcast, because I've got the privilege to sit down with the journalist, political analyst, and many other things more. John Matisonn, born in South Africa shortly after World War II. He is a very senior journalist, I could say, with all the experience he's got working for the major anti-apartheid journal newspaper that started in 1902. The Rand Daily Mail sort of collapsed under the pressure of apartheid eventually. He also works for the Sunday Times, the national broadcaster SABC, was correspondent for, I think, 6 South African newspapers in Washington. Also, vice versa, was South African correspondent for the National Public Radio in the USA, worked for the United Nations in Afghanistan for the public broadcaster and news that they're in organizing things, senior positions after the, what was it called? The UN's Electoral Media Commission. So that's a short introduction. His alma mater is Wits University, at the University of Witwatersrand. I had opportunity as a very young journalist of visiting your university during the national emergency state of South Africa in 1989, which is longer than we care to remember. But anyway, very interesting days, and we're going to talk about that. What we're going to do in this podcast is tackling John's main or major area of expertise first, journalism. A lot of things have changed there. And afterwards, we will move into the different eras of South Africa politically, what it was like, how it changed, why it changed, and how we arrived at today's South Africa, and what we may learn from the past to find out about the future. John wrote this major book a few years ago, God, Lies and Spies. And you also notice here, Finding South Africa's Future Through Its Past. That's what we're going to do. And after that, all problems solved, hopefully. Anyway, we'll start with the journalism part first. I'll share something of my personal experience. I started out as a journalist myself before I ended up in matters theology. I grew up in the old school of reporting, finding out facts, letting people decide. But end of the 1980s, I found that there was one exception to that rule, and that was South Africa. I managed to get into South Africa in 1989, as I said, difficult circumstances, national state of emergency. And through my contacts, I found out that then State President P.W. Botha was going to be replaced within the National Party by F.W. de Klerk. And what was more, that part of FW's vision for South Africa was releasing Nelson Mandela as soon as possible. That was the scoop of a lifetime. But no major news outlet wished to publish it once I returned to the Netherlands, because good news about South Africa was just not welcome. Eventually, I managed to publish it in a magazine in June 1989, which also had 100,000 subscribers or so, but nobody dared to take it up. And Since then, we've seen a movement, not only on the subject South Africa, but within Western journalism, from finding facts and enabling democracy, holding governments to account, to journalist as a public relation office that preaches whatever the powers that be, whether in industry or politics, want them to say, so that he has a living. In your book, I also noticed that you've encountered situations like that. 2003, Thabo Mbeki. Tell us all about it.
In 2003. Well,
Yeah.
first of all, I should just correct one point you made. I was blacklisted by the national broadcaster in South Africa throughout my career until 1994. So during the apartheid era, there was a list of people like me who were
Yeah.
not allowed ever to appear. So I never worked for them, and I did. I got a very good training at the Rand Daily Mail, which was the biggest morning paper in the country, and its editorial position was very anti-apartheid, but we were really trained to get the facts and to get everybody's perspective, and we found that even government officials and supporters would buy our paper, often secretly, because we would we would tell them more about their own community than their own, pro-government papers would do. So as a young reporter in the 70s, I was talking in Afrikaans to the party leaders of the ruling party, but also the parties to the right of it, as well as everything on the left. And so that was a really fantastic grounding. And of course, you're right.
Yeah.
It's got harder now. Of course, before 1994, the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, which had overwhelming media control, all the television and almost all the radio in 11 languages, was all controlled by the state broadcaster. And they really did bias every report. So what we did in the early 90s is, once we realized that democracy was coming, as it did in 1994, we worked hard to see that the SABC would cover that election fairly, and that it would give all sides an opportunity. And by and large, it was a real terrific time for journalism in 1994. People who'd never been allowed on television. People discovered, I had relatives who, very much steeped in the apartheid era, who said they didn't realize there were black analysts who knew so much and were so expert, because that had been kept from them. So suddenly the doors were thrown open and people could hear everybody's perspective. And it was really a wonderful time. But what you're referring to is by 2003, so that's 9 years into democracy, there was real pressure from the then president, Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki. And of course, it got even worse under President Zuma, his successor, who was notoriously corrupt. And they really believed that the public broadcaster should go back to being a state broadcaster. And so that was a very tricky time.
That's even Mbeki, and that was what I was actually thinking of. Try to get to the facts. He got them from the South African intelligence. He confronted Blair and Bush, but they didn't wish to listen to the truth and invaded Iraq anyway. You had a scoop of that.
Yes, that's in my book. I have a chapter. This is about the Iraq War.
Yeah.
I have a chapter called Bush, Blair, Spies and Lies. And what I found was, it was an oddity. South Africa's intelligence service isn't necessarily regarded as the best in the world, but for historic reasons, the intelligence service from the apartheid days had ties with Saddam Hussein's Iraq government, and they were people building nuclear weapons here in South Africa. We had a nuclear weapon. which we gave up just before democracy. And so they were talking to scientists in Iraq, and they knew them. And so what Mbeki did, he was dead against the Iraq war before it broke out in 2003. And so he called together this old apartheid era team of intelligence people, and including people with scientific expertise. And he sent them to Iraq to see if there were weapons of mass destruction, and which, as you know, was the premise for the war from Washington and London. And they came back and said, there's absolutely no doubt there are no weapons of mass destruction. And they could tell this because they knew the people working there, and they saw the people who'd been working on WMD were having a hard time. They were struggling to make ends meet and to find proper work because the program had genuinely been stopped. They went and saw the facilities. They had access to the intelligence from the US, from the UK, and from the United Nations. And they went to see every facility, and they had open access. And so not only what they saw, but their interactions with the locals made it clear to them that there were no WMD. And this was before the war started. They presented their report to President Mbeki, and he took it to the West. He did have contact with George Bush's White House, but he paid a special visit to London with several cabinet members. And he went out for a meeting with Tony Blair at Chequers, the British Prime Minister's weekend home. And he spent several hours with Blair alone, and he showed him everything he had. And he said, I'm telling you, there are no WMD in Iraq. And then his cabinet ministers had meetings with their counterparts to show what they had found. And Blair just made it clear that they were going to war anyway. And this was really a shattering experience for Mbeki, and I think really colored his relationship with the West after that. Because he'd gone to university in Britain, and he was close to the Labour Party, and he had a real affection for the sort of British left in Britain. And for him to see there were massive protests at the time, and many in Labour were unhappy with it, people he'd known for years, and then to see that Blair would go to war once this had all been spelled out to him. He never trusted the British again, and he became quite anti-British after that. So it really had a big impact.
Yes, it seems one of the shifts of international politics towards both Russia and perhaps China from that time on. Would you say it was already earlier?
There were relations. I mean, the ANC always wanted to have ties with China and Russia, but the closeness and the sort of blindness to facts that come out is much more recent. In the African National Congress, the ruling party, the party that was, of Mandela and Mbeki, today there is a much less thoughtful understanding of Russia and of China. They accept what they're told from Russia and China, and they tend to disregard media in the West. Yeah, and of course, as you're referring to, we all have to be very vigilant these days because media worldwide is so hard to distinguish reliable information from unreliable information. But they really distrust the West more instinctively now. Not all of them, not necessarily President Ramaphosa, but many in the hierarchy, and who are very influential, just do not trust the West.
Yeah, once bitten, twice shy.
Mm-hmm.
You told us about what you apparently, with some reason, see as the golden years of journalism in South Africa around 1994. You were also involved with the SABC board at the time, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
And
Well, I was on the board more recently, but in '94, when President Mandela took office, the first democratic government, I was part of the broadcast regulator. We set up a new broadcast regulator, which had never existed under apartheid, so that we could open radio, especially, but also TV, to a wide range of voices, both commercial and community, and also to protect the public broadcaster. And our constitution says we must ensure that the public broadcaster, the SABC, provides independent and independent information and journalism. And so in those first 4 years, 94 to 98, we were very pleased with what we achieved. We opened up a huge number of commercial radio stations and especially community stations, so that people would have a choice in their own language for the first time, and also a choice of opinions or of different institutions controlling the media. And that was a really good time. And I would say by 98, when I left, I felt very comfortable that we'd achieved a lot in 4 years. We opened, I can't remember, it was over 100 new radio stations, one new independent television station nationally, and we were working on all sorts of other things. So I was pleased then, but especially in the time of Zuma, who was involved with, under whose tenure the corruption really got out of hand in South Africa, and I think that's now well established. The pressures on the media and on the boards of SABC got much worse. Then I came. It was 2017 when I was invited back onto the SABC board.
oh,
And
yes.
that was an interesting time because Ramaphosa was just taking over from Zuma. And in South Africa, we have this term Ramaphoria, because everyone felt euphoric when Ramaphosa came in, because he's a very popular, charming man. He does support, he's a constitutionalist. He's now seen to have many, many flaws, and unfortunately, some of them are true. But he basically was well-intentioned, and people expected so much from him.
Yeah.
And so in that stage, I was on the board, and we were trying and we freed up the journalists. We told them, you don't work for us, you don't work for the state, you don't answer to the state, you answer to your viewers and your listeners. And we had some success with that. And even today, I would say the SABC has some good journalists and has some independent journalism, but I don't think it's really got back to where it needs to be at all.
From your time at the, what was it called? Because I was mixing up two boards, that of the Independent Broadcaster Authority.
Independent Broadcasting Authority, yeah.
Yes.
That was the
in your book, you mention that there were some inklings of corruption or cultural differences, but you felt uncomfortable with the accepting gifts, and that was also held against you, that Councillor Matisonn did not accept gifts while others did with great gratitude.
It was so frustrating because we came into office in '94 around the time that Mandela came in, and we were full of idealism, and I felt so passionate, that Black South Africans have been deprived of so many things for 300 years. We have the weight of 300 years on our shoulders. We have to get services to people who've been deprived and show them what democracy can mean and do for them. And it was exciting, and we got a lot of things right. But the frustrating thing was I picked up on the board itself several people, and by the way, some of them were from the ANC, and others who were black, and others were whites from the old guard of the old apartheid era.
Yeah.
on the board who were open to taking things they shouldn't have and becoming, a regulator has a great deal of power because you grant licenses and you adjudicate matters. And so, for me, it was very obvious that you have to be, like Caesar's wife, above suspicion,
Yeah.
because conflicts of interest so easily arise. If you take a gift from a TV station, you're compromised very easily. And I noticed that my colleagues didn't agree with that, and they were all too keen to take it. And so, in fact, the first post-democracy or democracy era corruption case was in our organization, which was very painful. I never really recovered emotionally from the stress of those years.
But would you? I'm afraid that the problem has gotten worse than in those days. But I'm an idealist. You shouldn't give up hope. Uh, would there technically be ways that the government, that organizations that are supposed to be independent people with judgment, uh, in the current South African situation, would you be able to think of mechanisms that we could enforce integrity in high places, or is
Well,
that a lost case?
no, I don't think it's a lost cause. There are still some terrific journalists in South Africa today doing absolutely courageous and really important work. And I think that must be emphasized. But of course, as you know, around the world and including South Africa, the big negative on journalism has been that the business model for newspapers and TV and radio has collapsed. The advertising model, which sustained newspapers historically, but also television and radio, where it's commercial, that has collapsed, and the revenue has really collapsed. And what has really happened is that that revenue has shifted. Even when sites go online, it doesn't shift. The ads don't go to those online. So if you're a newspaper and you go online, and even when you pick up a lot of viewers or readers, you don't get the same level of advertising support as you used to, because it goes somewhere else, and it goes in particular to Google and Facebook and obviously other social platforms. And of course, they don't hire a single journalist.
No.
So
How is national media? I mean, the nationale pers, the Burger, that organization. How is it possible that they have been so economically successful internationally despite this development? Did
well,
they see it
again,
coming, or?
for people who don't know, NASPERS, the News 24, as it is, has a website that is very powerful. It's the most powerful media organization in the country. But they just closed all but one newspaper. They're down to only one newspaper, physical newspaper, Die Burger. It's the only one you can still buy on the streets. So the Sunday paper Rapport, which I bought meticulously, is no longer available on the street corner, although it is online, but it's not quite the same. So they've been hit, and they're very cost conscious. But the thing you need to know is that the Naspers company, which started off in 1915 under Dr. D.F. Malan as editor, who was a theologian, who later became the first prime minister in 1948 of the apartheid era. He ran on apartheid in 1948 and won. And under Malan, that was the start of this company that's now called Naspers. But what has happened since has been truly historic. Years ago, there was a brilliant up-and-coming entrepreneur who was the son of an intelligence analyst in the apartheid intelligence system. And he started first a television station with government approval as a sort of semi-private one. Actually a private one, but government approved, and there was no news in it. So there were certain limitations, but it started, and he made a lot of money out of that for the company. And then he invested around the world in startups during the dot-com early days. And one of them hit the jackpot. He invested $30 million into a tiny little startup in China, which you may know today is Tencent. Yes. Tencent is one of the biggest media companies in the world. And his $30 million investment turned into, let me do the calculation quickly, several $100 billion. Wow. And that made it the biggest company on the South African Stock Exchange. Biggest company on the South African Stock Exchange. And so that's transformed the performance of the company. And that's why they can continue to do things. But I have to tell you, they have greatly reduced their media offering. They've stopped a lot of the magazines. As I say, there's almost nothing left in terms of physical newspapers. There's only one left. And they have kept News 24 as a strong online outlet. It is one of the best sources of news in South Africa still, and I think they do have good professional standards.
Yeah, you mentioned Malan. We will move to him and that time in the 20th century shortly. But as far as journalism is concerned, I understand the national press, Naspers, better now. So it's actually outside South Africa that it's been kept floating from outside. And from outside South Africa, there also was a Nigerian newspaper that you helped to start up in South Africa with a South African edition. I found that interesting. Tell us a little bit more about that, please.
It really is a story. I haven't written, it's not in my last book. I'm going to have to write it in my next one. Because I was approached by a Nigerian publisher of a paper called This Day. And he wanted to start a newspaper in South Africa. And this was, of course, before we got the scare of .com and the whole undermining of the financial model that we've always used. So we still thought newspapers could work, although perhaps we could have seen the writing on the wall. But so I met with him and I started doing some research. And what I found was that he was a very colorful figure, but he was courageous about press freedom. And he had stood up to the president of Nigeria. He even escaped on a boat one day when they were trying to arrest him. So he was courageous about independent journalism, and he gave me assurances to that effect. And we started the paper. I was the editorial director. We hired an editor. And we did some very good stuff. People loved the paper. It was very much admired, but it just never, and it was printing nationally. So it was extremely ambitious. But it never worked. And after a couple of years, it very sadly closed down. And many people really hark back to those days as the best days of their careers. But I'm afraid
yes, years ago I sat down with Hannes Siebert, the guy who later was in the Commission for Reconciliation and Truth with Bishop Tutu. He had an adventure with the paper for the military too, and it didn't work out, but it was still something he didn't regret doing.
Oh yes, no, it was exciting, and we did some excellent work.
Yes, a colleague of us perhaps did too, as the first editor of the Burger, and that makes us talk about D.F. Malan, the first prime minister at the time in 48 with National Party rule. We said goodbye to General Smuts. and his Verenigde Partij, the United Party. My late father-in-law once stood for the United Party, one of the Bloemfontein districts. He turned it into a contested seat, which was quite something at the time, early 1970s. But yeah, he didn't make it. The times were not with him, so he went back to farming. But Malan was Nationale Partij, National Party. It was just 1 year before you were born, if I do my maths correctly. You were just a tiny little baby at the time when Malan. But what change did that make to South Africa and perhaps Magisfontein? Oh, Magisfontein! I also read that your gr grandfather fought in the Anglo-Boer War on the good side. Tell us a little bit about your
Um,
family history, growing up in Joburg at the time.
right. Well, there's a lot to unpack in that. I mean,
You're
because
welcome.
he didn't, he didn't fight in the Anglo-Boer War. My grandfather was a Jewish Norwegian. He grew up in Norway, and he decided to come to South Africa shortly after the Anglo-Boer War. So,
Aha.
as you can, I mean, if you cast your mind back to those times, the Scandinavians opposed the British. You know, the sort of common cultural feeling was, why is
Yes.
the British fighting the locals being the white Afrikaans speakers, the whites,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
why
Just
did
like
the
Verwoerd's parents, they
yes,
arrived shortly after the war too as
right.
Boer supporters from the Netherlands.
Yes. And so he was much more sympathetic to the Afrikaner side of politics, and he was active in politics. And he wasn't in the Boer War, but in 1915 he was arrested for opposing South Africa's participation in World War One on the side of Britain,
Ah, so
because
he was a rebel.
yeah, he was a rebel. And
Yeah.
but of course, the argument is still made, and I think it's got some logic. And remember, the liberals in Britain at the time were sympathetic to the to the Boers, as opposed to the British.
Yes, Emily
And
Ophouse, people like that. Story of
House,
an
yeah,
African farm, that lady. Yeah.
that's right, Olive Schreiner. And and of course, the World War One was not a moral war in the way World War Two was because of Hitler. Obviously, my grandfather was anti-Germany and anti-Hitler in World
Yeah.
War Two. But in World War One, and I know if you read this, the Oxford scholars have been writing about it more recently, there's a common view that it was a war that should never have happened. The issues were trade and power and so on, and should have been resolved. And in
Yeah.
fact, when it started, nobody expected it to be as devastating as it turned out to be. So I think his position at that time is still defensible. But to get to your point about 1948 and the arrival of Milan, it's important to realize that before 1948, there was enormous discrimination against black people. The whites mostly had the vote. There were a few exceptions where blacks did have the vote, but it didn't amount to very much. So it was a segregated state before Dr. Milan took power. But Dr. Milan, as the leader of the National Party, who brought it from an opposition force into government in 1948, his party's guiding philosophy was apartheid, and was the first time they used the term apartheid, meaning keep the races separate. And so that's when it started to become institutionalized. And in the years afterwards, after that, they made marriage between people of different races illegal. They made sex illegal between the races. They legalized all sorts of racial issues like separating benches for whites and benches for blacks and buses for whites and buses. And of course, there was enormous segregation and discrimination before 1948, but there were parts of South Africa where there was quite a fair amount of integration. For instance, in Cape Town, and the Malan era set the policy to eliminate all racial mixing, to actually close down suburbs that were black in so-called white cities, and forcibly remove people from their homes and all that sort of thing. So it became much rougher. And then, of course, in the 50s, they banned Mandela's political party. Mandela started a civil disobedience campaign, sort of a Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi kind of thing in the 50s. And he was the leader of that. But it was cracked down on pretty heavily. He was on the run. And that was when the ANC and Mandela himself decided to move to the so-called armed struggle.
Yes, just for clarity, the the primary school you visited or attended, the high school, only white kids,
In my school, oh, absolutely, yes. Yes.
and that was general in South Africa at the time, that people would go to school by race and segregate in their own area.
Absolutely, pretty much universal. In the 70s, I became aware of a few private schools that would accept black South Africans and some of the church supported schools and so on. But that was only started in the 70s. And they had to go through government. They had to fight for acceptance. I mean, for instance, at university, the government passed a law called the Extension of Universities Education Act, which actually didn't extend education. It reduced it because it said that races couldn't mix at university either. But they allowed certain exceptions. And so Nelson Mandela, for instance, was studying at my old university, Wits, in the 50s, because he couldn't study. He had to get special permission on the grounds that black institutions couldn't provide him the education, the specific education he was going for. So there were exceptions. But even at university, there was a very small number. When I got to university in the late 60s, there were a few black and Indian origin South Africans, but still a small number.
What was it like to grow up in these days? Because as I recall, suburbs, my experience only dates back to the end of the 1980s when I first visited South Africa. And after that, I lived there for a period as I studied there and was permanent resident. But I noticed that towards the end of the 80s, the gardens sort of looked like the suburbs here in Europe or in the USA. Low fences. There might be bars before windows that opened just to avoid convenience theft. But that was all. And over the years, I saw things changing in South Africa to barbed wire, to worse, to high fences, to electric current, to 5-minute armed response. And it seems that, especially in the Transvaal and Free State, and also some areas of Cape Town, the good people are living behind bars in South Africa instead of the other situation you have in, say, normal countries.
I would say that's true everywhere, even in the Cape Town area nowadays. The
Ah,
security is prime, and they use private security firms because can't rely on the police. But you're right. In those days, in the white areas, people didn't feel too worried about crime. I think that in the black areas it was much worse.
yeah.
But yeah, that's absolutely true, and it is true that yeah, from the from it has got worse. And I mean, we talked a little bit about President Zuma under his presidency, which was from 2008 to about 2017. The corruption was so enormous that in South Africa we use the term state capture, that the state was captured by the cronies and friends and relatives of President Zuma. And it really hollowed out the state to an enormous extent. So policing declined immensely. There was an enormous amount of corruption in the police and the prosecuting authority, as well as in every other area. You're probably aware that we've just come out of a period where electricity blackouts were a daily occurrence, all around the country. They've just got rid of that for the moment, and we're still holding our thumbs that this doesn't return soon. But yes, that's all the result of the Zuma era, particularly.
I've read Andre de Ruyter's book on Truth to Power and what Eskom looked like from the inside, and I'm not sure where he is now, but he might have left for overseas to have a safer job. But anyway, under him, things improved, and it was not receiving emails about blackouts at your world-class university all the time, as I received. As I'm also part of Potchefstroom University and Noordwest University. Yes, that's a strange experience if you've not been through it. Please switch off your air conditioning or don't use your computer too much when you're supposed to do research. And yes,
even as late as last year. It got to its worst in 2023, as late as and to the point that there were days where you were without electricity for up to 10 hours of the day. Now that all declined last year, 2024, and we've actually now had about 8 or 9 months free of national blackouts. There are occasionally local stations that go down for a little while, but we haven't had a national blackout for something like 9 months.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, then,
but one of the reasons for that is that people got so fed up that it accelerates the private sector to get solar.
Oh, so that's a big part of it.
It's a big part of it that people now solar. I mean, where I live. Everybody I know has got it or investigated getting it on their rooftops. Rooftop solar alone is responsible for something like, 7, 8% or 10% of the national usage. And certain big users of electricity, like the mines, have set up their own solar and battery facilities to cover the whole mine. So that's relieved the national pressure. But actually, since de Ruyter's left, the management of Eskom seems to be good.
Good.
The Eskom is improving its performance a little as well.
Yeah, in his book, he also told his readers that he had left some capable, also black management behind who really believed in his approach. So it's good to hear that continues. If we go back to your youth in those days, despite Malan and Strijdom and the politics that you probably didn't worry too much about, did you have a happy youth in the old South Africa?
Not especially, but I was very, very political. At a very young age, I was fighting with my father about politics. And I didn't like apartheid, and we had quite bits. My father was a contrarian. He would never have said he supported apartheid, but he certainly was used to discrimination and So we clashed a lot over politics. Actually, it really damaged our relationship permanently. And so I was very conscious of it, and I always wanted to do something that would be a way to fight apartheid in my own way. And that was the reason I chose journalism.
What age was that about, and which prime minister was in control of South Africa?
Well, the one I remember from that time would be John Vorster, who came after Melania had strayed on, then Verwoerd. And Verwoerd was the man who, Hendrik Verwoerd, had a doctorate from the Netherlands, also a very strong Christian. But he was the one who was considered very, very bright, an intellectual in his own way. But he'd been born in the Netherlands, as you know, come here at, I think, the age of 4, so to South Africa. But he was the one who gave apartheid its philosophical fleshing out. Yeah. And he came up with the idea that segregation is essential, but that meant you must accept that we give blacks political rights in their traditional areas. And so there was really actually a policy that we would fight urbanization, and that we would actually turn back the tide of urbanization and send more and more Black South Africans back to the traditional homeland areas, and eventually give them some form of independence. So it was Verwoerd who gave it that kind of philosophical bearing. And then I was early teens, I think, when he was assassinated. There was one failed assassination. He was shot, but he survived. Yeah. And a little later, he was stabbed to death in the parliamentary, in his seat in the parliamentary assembly building.
How was that possible that something like that happened? Because they would have had the intelligence on Saventas, and to allow someone like that in the heart of call it South African democracy at the time, that almost seems like to Trump in Pennsylvania, with circumstances allowing to happen.
Well, I would make a couple of points to you. First of all, you referred to the lack of security. Even after Verwoerd, when I became a journalist, the prime minister was his successor, John Vorster. And John Vorster was considered the sort of much more security conscious, and believed in a strong police, and would violate the rule of law to protect whites. And even when Vorster was prime minister, I remember on my own as a 20-something-year-old walking in Pretoria around the offices, and walking into the prime minister's office, into the secretary's office, and the secretary wasn't there, and I put my head through the door to the prime minister's office, and nobody was there to stop me. So even in the 60s and early 70s, security was not nearly what we can imagine today, anywhere in the world probably. But the second thing is that Safenis, the guy who got himself a job as a steward in the parliament, as a page in the parliament, and got himself, and was therefore able to go into the National Assembly, and then pulled out a knife and stabbed him. And Stephanus was a strange, unusual character, because he looked white. So that was the assumption that he was, like other South African whites, no threat to the white prime minister. But he had, after he was captured, of course, immediately and tried, and the conclusion was that he was mentally unfit, that he was crazy. But recent books have come out and shown that actually he did have some racial hostility to apartheid. He was from a Portuguese and Greek background, and he had experienced some discrimination in South Africa. And it seems quite likely that his motivation, which was passed off by the authorities as pure craziness, actually had a political motivation.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about situations like that in hindsight and taking into account the circumstances of the day. A lot of people don't do that. They just look from their bias into old situations and different circumstances. But that's an
True.
important point. Security wasn't what it is
Well,
like
as I
like
say,
today.
I mean, it sounds hard to believe, doesn't it, that after the assassination of the prime minister, one unsuccessful and one successful, the next prime minister had no real security around his office. I mean, maybe he wasn't there, maybe he'd gone out or something, but you would, in today, would be quite impossible. There would be guards everywhere.
Yeah, and even you as a young anti-apartheid journalist, because the authorities would have known you like that, being able to knock,
Yes.
knock, hello.
Oh, absolutely. I actually put my head in the door. There was nobody there. If they had been there, they would have probably been quite brusque. But I could get my head in the door without being stopped.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It was only in the very late 70s, I remember, that the union buildings in Pretoria, where the ministers and prime ministers' offices were, it was late 70s that I remember under P.W. Botha that they finally started putting security gates so you couldn't get into the building without going through security.
It was an interesting time also internationally, the 1970s under Forster. You talk in your book about the breaking of the cordon sanitaire, South Africa
1924.
losing its friends and barriers against communism, and eventually the major allies dropping South Africa or putting it on notice. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Well, what I discovered in my book, which was really, I find fascinating, is it's 1976. Everybody knows it in South Africa as the year of the Soweto uprising. And it was an uprising by black school kids who resented having to study Afrikaans language. And that's the story that's told. And Steve Biko was alive in that time and was a very influential leader of the so-called Black consciousness movement. But what I discovered in my book, I got hold of some memos from the Gerald Ford, we know as president in that period in the US. And I got hold of some archival material in the Ford Presidential Library that showed that was the pivotal time. There were a couple of months when everything was happening, and Forster was really unable to keep up because Kissinger, he had meetings with Kissinger, and Kissinger was saying things have to start changing, and he was surprised at that. I mean, he sort of knew it, but he expected a Republican president would be easy on South Africa. But what I discovered is that there was a crucial CIA analysis in 1976 where they concluded, and this was under George H.W. Bush Sr., was head of the CIA at the time, and they discovered that, the CIA analysis concluded that the battle in Zimbabwe, then still called Rhodesia, was going very badly for the white government, and that it could be lost within 2 years by 1978, and that the Cubans who were operating in Angola might well come into the Zimbabwean guerrilla forces were good fighters, and they might even get Cuban support, and they could take the white government within 2 years. Now, I think with hindsight, that may not be true, but it doesn't matter what we think. What matters is what they believed at the time. And this affected Kissinger very significantly. By the way, if you look at Kissinger's memoirs, he writes very little about this period for reasons I think we can guess. But there are other biographers who've written more about this period with Kissinger, and I've spoken to people in Washington. And so he realized And the thing about Kissinger, he was a very decisive strategist. And he really believed that if you have an unpleasant historical event coming, the best thing to do is get out ahead of it and lead it. And then you can have some kind of control of the outcome. So he started in 1976. He told there was a meeting in Pretoria, which I was actually outside of, didn't know what was going on inside, with the then Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith, the last white Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, at which Kissinger said to him, "Your days are numbered."
I've read The Great Betrayal. It's very interesting to I think he retired in the Cape actually, but to see both sides of it. Yeah, I'm sure he felt betrayed.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, the really odd part, I don't know if you noticed, remember this from my book, Kissinger's wife, Nancy, I think her name was very pro Ian Smith. She thought of Ian Smith, this white leader, as a hero. And she was, this was all at the ambassador's residence in Pretoria. I remember that day very well. And she was really, saw Ian Smith as a hero. He'd been fought in the World War II as a fighter pilot. He'd been injured. It affected his expression on his face. And so he came out of the meeting with her husband, telling him, your power is over. And Kissinger's wife rushed up. Kissinger's wife rushed up to Ian Smith and grabbed him, hugged him openly, and said, "I think you're terrific." And of course, Smith looked even more astonished than he normally did, because her husband had just, cut him off at the knees.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been good for Kissinger's marriage. I don't think he writes about that in his memoirs either.
I don't know that is in his memoirs. I think it's quite clear why.
Yes. But back to the Forster years, what was your impression of him as a politician?
Forster was a good politician. He was an actor. He knew how to play his audience.
Okay, Ronald Reagan.
Yes, but for a much more authoritarian environment. His speeches. I went to hear him speech in the city halls, and he would start very low voice, and he'd build up to a crescendo about the dangers of the communists and the people who hate us and want to bring us down, and so on. So as a politician, he was a shrewd politician. But what he's remembered for most in South Africa is what South African opponents would call the jackboot. He was Minister of Police and Justice. He brought in all sorts of detention rules that violated what we regard as the rule of law.
Yeah.
And he brought in first 90-day detention, so you didn't have to be brought before a judge, and eventually the Terrorism Act, which said you can be detained for indefinitely without being brought before a judge. So he's remembered for that, for being very hard or very tough on anti-apartheid forces and African nationalists.
Was it in his days that you yourself nearly ended up in jail and were only pardoned by P.W. Botha?
Well, yes. Well, yeah, actually, that's correct. While Forster was still prime minister, they later changed the title to president. So there was a period where he was prime minister. He was prime minister.
Yes, so it was changed under PW that it became the Office of State President. That the first day of the separation with C.R. Swart and those people were State President, and
in those
later on
days,
one office.
It was really a legacy of British colonial rule. But we had a prime minister, and then what would have been the Queen's representative was now called the Governor General, and then the State President.
Yeah.
But had no power. So it was a ceremonial position that had almost no power.
Yeah, Foster retired like that, didn't he? After he became sort of
Yes,
state
yes,
president after
yes.
he was prime minister.
And when Forster retired, P.W. Botha made himself state president and took all the power. And so that abolished the ceremonial position and brought together. So the president was both the president and what would have been called the prime minister.
Yeah, die
That
groot
was
krokodil.
yeah, that was under P.W. Botha. But so I was breaking stories about a scandal in government at the time, which you know about, and
The
I
information
was
scandal for our listeners, the
information
Muldergate or
scandal. That's
whoever you
right.
want to call it.
That's right. And I was arrested and charged and brought to court. I wasn't charged initially. I was arrested and brought to court, and they said they wanted. I had to give them my sources of my stories about the information scandal. And when I refused, I got a prison sentence. But then it was suspended on appeal, and it was while I was and I lost in the so I lost in the lower court, then I lost in the what was then called the Supreme Court with a High Court, and then I went to the appeal court by 1980, and I lost in the appeal court as well. So I was then due to go straight to jail. And P.W. Botha was now president by this time. All this had happened just during that time. It took 3 or 4 years. And he called my editor and said, tell Matisonn to wait. And we now know that he did a telephone whip around to get the cabinet to agree to give me a presidential pardon. And that's in the minutes somewhere. So I got a presidential pardon. So I never served time.
Yeah, that's quite exceptional. Exceptional. You would be
But
one of the few people in South Africa who ever received a presidential pardon, I imagine.
yes, but actually there is a specific part that I left out. I had been allowed to go to America on condition I came home to prison. And I had been made the Washington correspondent of my newspaper group. So I was in Washington when this happened, and Ronald Reagan had become president. I think it was these facts all made all the difference. I was very lucky because P.W. Botha now, after the trauma he'd have with Kissinger and even bigger trauma under Jimmy Carter and Andrew
Oh yeah.
Young and those people, and now they had Ronald Reagan, a new conservative, and they were planning for months how to get the foreign minister to meet with Reagan in the White House in the Oval Office. And that was just coming to a boil when I lost my appeal. And so I went around I had an office in the National Press Building in Washington, and I went around the whole building telling every journalist in every journalism office that I was sorry I couldn't be there next week because I was going home to prison. And so they wrote about it. And someone I know was
Well done.
in Calcutta, and he switched on the radio and said, John Matisonn, South African journalist, is about to go home to prison. And so P.W. Botha decided that this would be really bad news if all my colleagues were riled up about me being in prison while he was meeting with the president. So that's the real reason I got the pardon, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but at least you stayed out, which is a good thing.
Because the law was quite curious. The law allowed that although the first sentence would be short, they could then bring you and charge you again and again and again, and the sentences would get very long then.
Yeah, so the 70s, if we look at it politically, it was really a hardening of the climate, greater pressure from the outside, radicalization within the ANC towards violence. On the opposite side, more violence and lack of justice to control it. So, boiling point, Soweto, Sharpeville. Uh, did it feel like sitting on a powder keg in those days?
Yes, yes. I mean, the interesting thing is, as a journalist, I was covering all of that, of course, as a political journalist, but I was also covering the negotiations for Zimbabwe, which led to the independence and democracy in 1980. And at the same time, I spent a lot of time in Namibia, then called Southwest Africa. And there were all these efforts then that after Zimbabwe, that Namibia was next. This is the point you made about the cordon sanitaire. In 1974, the Portuguese government fell, and that ended the war in Mozambique and Angola, our two sort of neighboring states that were white controlled by the Portuguese government, colonial government. Once those were gone, there was no cordon sanitaire except for Namibia and Zimbabwe. So once Zimbabwe went, the negotiations were on for Namibia. And Namibia had a particular status under the United Nations. It was a mandate or trusteeship with the United Nations. And so, and South Africa was the trustee, but obviously, legally, or in terms of international law, our South Africa's power was limited. And so the negotiations were on to hand it over. And it was only really resolved by 1990. But by the late 70s, it was already a very much a live issue. And there were several serious efforts to get Namibia settled. And it was quite obvious to everybody that they were buying time. And obviously the pressure would start on South Africa next. But the diplomatic focus was on those two.
And you had, as a journalist, the I would call fascinating opportunity to be really close to those two processes of transition, close to both. If you observe what happened, was there any indication that Namibia would go as well as it did, because it's one of the better governed countries presently in the Southern African region, and Zimbabwe was just a collapse into something far, far worse than the white government of Ian Smith ever was.
Well, I spent 19 months in the United Nations in Afghanistan in senior positions. And and I've done a lot of reading about when you arrive in a place like that, you've had no time to really know the local situation. But by the time I finished, because there was a break between my first tour and my second, I'd done a lot of reading and thinking and interviewing and so on. And what I would say is, in all these transitions, the international governments and institutions are not really very well prepared. And so when you talk about what happened in Zimbabwe, I can tell you that most of the authorities, the South Africans thought that Mugabe would lose. And the British...
I recall that the bishop would win. Yeah.
The British thought that Mugabe would lose. I mean, I got an off-the-record briefing with my colleagues from the South African apartheid government of Pik Botha, the foreign minister, who said the bishop's going to win. And so they were surprised that Mugabe won. So I think that sort of helps answer your point. They weren't really prepared.
There was not reading the situation correctly.
Yes, because to read it correctly, you really have to rely on people with deep local roots.
Yeah, who don't just tell you what you want to hear, but give you facts.
And it can't be short-term diplomats, do a 2-year rotation or 3 years. You have to really dig deep. I mean, there were people who knew that Mugabe was going to win, but so I think that's helps explain why. I mean, Mugabe was, and then with Namibia, Namibia was slightly better prepared because it was the United Nations mandate. The SWAPO, which was accepted by the UN as the main liberation movement, did get a bit more training. So I think that may have helped. I don't know how much, but that was a factor. But the other point about Namibia is it's a very low population. It's a
Yeah,
big
that also
country.
helps. The less conflict, less people.
When I was covering Namibia in the 70s, there were just over 1 million people. I think now it's as high as 2 million. Um,
Yeah,
and
and it's a large country for 2 million people.
yes,
If you compare to the Netherlands, the crowd people in say 1/3 or so of the Orange Free State,
yeah.
and
But
we've
remember that a lot of it is desert.
yes, that's
A
right. The
lot of it
Namib,
is.
Kalahari,
But
yeah.
still, it's very sparse population, so it's easier to manage. And they also have found quite a lot of resources. And funnily enough, they've managed their mining rights far better than South Africa. It's considered a good place for investors to invest because the mining system is quite efficient. They have something called a cadastral system, which makes corruption very much harder. In South Africa, corruption around the mining sector is very, very high.
Is their
And
system similar to Botswana?
yes, 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 much more similar. Um, yeah. The other, but there are other factors which one can see now with hindsight about Zimbabwe. First of all, ZANU, the Mugabe's movement, was never as a strong democratic political entity in the way that the ANC is, or even SWAPO. ZANU is very much a military organized, they had their military, their army, which was probably the most efficient of the liberation armies. And the leaders of ZANU were the leaders of the army.
Ah, so
And
it was
that's
basically a military coup too.
well, yes, and that explains the difficulty that they've had in the last 20 years. When an opposition guy is likely to win, the military have actually said, we will not allow him to take over. We won't take orders from him.
Yes, where do you go from there? If that's
So that's a very different situation. But then also, I do think that, so that's, I mean, very serious point. But I think also that the handling of things like the land issue hasn't been handled well by the Western powers. Um, Funnily
you're
enough,
talking Zimbabwe now.
yes, talking about Zimbabwe, because remember, Zimbabwe is much more rural. So, whereas South Africa, in fact, most people who wanted liberation would have been urban. There's still a demand for land, and it's still a tricky issue. But in Zimbabwe, much more so. Most people are tied to the land. And so the issue was about land reform. And funnily enough, Kissinger had a very bold plan for land reform with a substantial amount of money. But nothing happened under him. He was out of office in 1981. And the subsequent deals under Thatcher, in fact, and the British, by then, the British made no such offers to buy the land. So the land issue was never properly resolved. Now, I mean, you have in South Africa, you also have the problem of a new government's ability to manage land reform. To manage land reform well takes a lot of skill. You really need bureaucrats who know their stuff and are given proper resources and so on. You need to have extension officers. You can't just hand over land. It's not about, it's all about what you give them with the land. They need financing, they need transportation, they need marketing, they need advice on seeds and
Yeah,
markets.
education, because we in Zimbabwe we saw the bread basket of Southern Africa turning into a famine area. Uh, how would you say has South Africa managed up till now, as far as land is concerned?
Not very well. Not very well. We've had a bit of land reform. As I say, it's not quite the same importance of the issue, although there are many South African politicians who say land is the key to everything. But the ANC has not done it because it's been difficult. They haven't had the spare funding for it. And I mean, our constitution, we haven't discussed this. I mean, we're very proud of our constitution. It's considered one of the best democratic constitutions in the world. And it builds on the German model, so it's much more advanced than, say, the American Constitution and so on.
It's more
And
federally based.
Yeah. So right. So the issue with our Constitution provides for land reform. Well, and I've spoken to judges who have complained that the government never used the Constitution. They should have tested cases in court, because obviously the judges can only act when a case is brought to them. So land reform has really been grossly inadequate. And people who are entitled to land, it takes years and years for it to be transferred. There are problems about tenure. And of course, one of the issues, but it doesn't excuse the government at all, is that at the 11th hour in 1994, when they were settling the new constitution, the politicians representing the Zulu king demanded that he have control over an enormous amount of land in the KwaZulu-Natal area. And that means that a lot of that land is now idle. So you've got the strange thing now where traditionalist politicians are using left-wing language to demand that the king control the land. But the truth is the ANC hasn't done very well with land reform.
Yes. So we had that say that first era of your life with Foster as a young journalist, increasing pressure on South Africa, internal political, I would call shock, because at the time it was unimaginable that an Afrikaner politician would lie against Parliament, because that's lying against God. That's breaking your oath in a way, and it's basically killed the crown prince of the National Party, and it was revealed that the Minister Mulder at the time was lying, in part because of your revelations as a young journalist. At the same time, we've got those things outside South Africa with the Allies falling away and what was considered the enemy at the time coming closer.
Yeah.
But, yes, you go
ahead.
ahead.
I would say the one thing I would point to that you should not lose sight of, if there wasn't internal uprising in South Africa, I don't think it would have changed as nearly so fast. Foreign pressure was driven in good part by the fact that things were no longer tenable in South Africa. There were protests. The government was losing control of the security situation. The protests were going on in every town in South Africa. I went to countless protests as a journalist in the 80s, funerals, one after the other, that would become political events. The ANC was banned, and yet people would show up at a funeral and they'd bring out the ANC flag and they'd sing songs about the ANC. So they were flouting the rules more and more. And the government, we now know the government realized it couldn't control it for that long. And we were lucky, I would say, in both de Klerk and Mandela, that you had smart politicians who understood the terms of negotiation and drove it. But I don't think any of the pressure would have been there internationally if it hadn't been for the uprising internally. And of course, we were on television. Those protests and the violence were on television globally. It was leading the news all over the world.
You knew Mandela personally.
Yes,
What do you think was the trigger that drove him into violence? Some would call it terrorism, because that was probably what it effectually was. And how did he deal with that for his conscience? Because initially he wasn't a violent man, and then in later years yes, perhaps a violent politician in some respects, uh, but not in the way of Mugabe or other people at all.
No, that one needs to be clear about what he was and what he wasn't.
Yeah,
Um, the ANC had a policy of not killing civilians. And he would have been insisted on that policy, but it wasn't alone. I mean, that was the view of the leadership, but it was a military struggle. What happened was he had been what they called campaign, the head of the Defiance campaign. He was the
yeah.
leader of the Defiance campaign of Martin Luther King style nonviolent protest. And after a while, he concluded, as even Bishop Tutu said, for nonviolence to work, the other side has to have enough moral
Integrity.
integrity to respond to nonviolence. If you protest nonviolent and people just kill you and nobody notices or cares, it doesn't work. It depends on that public factor. So he decided on it. He always wanted negotiations, and he saw violence as one of the tools. But the other thing I was going to say is Mandela, one of the many things that was so interesting about him is how he used books. When he was studying political tactics and strategy, he read Mahatma Gandhi and he would take notes. But he was not reading as an academic, he was reading as a politician, as a strategist. And he read Marx that way too. I don't believe he ever became a Marxist. We can debate that if you like. But he read it to try and understand what he could learn from it, what he could take away from it. And when he was thinking about violence, he went and read von Clausewitz, the military thinker.
Yes, I'm aware of that. The Prussian general. Yes, with his.
So he studied military issues, and so he was thinking in a military way, not in a terrorism way.
Yes, about war as a continuation of politics.
Yeah.
So he saw his struggle in that way too.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to gloss over what the ANC did. There was violence. There were civilians killed, but I think the gestation of his ideas really came from that.
Okay. And any other people from those days that you met that were part of the struggle?
Oh, I met so many. What was remarkable and is rather sad today when you look at the quality of our leadership, because it's really not great in the ANC. But I got to know all the top people around him: Joe Slovo, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki's father, and the others, Kathy Kathrada, Dennis Goldberg. The interesting thing about them was they were impressive personally. The biggest weakness, which showed after 1994, is they didn't understand economics and running an economy. I mean, South Africa, as you know, is a sophisticated economy relatively.
Oh, yes.
And Mandela had the integrity and humility to know he couldn't do it himself. But he relied on Mbeki had a master's degree in economics from Britain, from Sussex University. And so he handed that over to Mbeki, and he trusted him. But but those guys, if you take that out of the equation, which of course is more and more important today, but Mandela and Sisulu and the others were remarkable people. They were impressive. On Robben Island, they would recite Shakespeare at each other. There was that famous line of poetry: "How can a man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods?" That phrase was recited over and over on Robben Island, and people would teach each other about Shakespeare, and they would read Shakespeare. So it was a different quality of person, and they did really care about and Mandela, I mean, the thing about Mandela, he hated it, coming out of jail in 1990 and seeing the way we and people in the West talk about politicians with such dismissive, disparaging. He hated that because he said a politician his job is to bring peace. And he took it seriously, and he saw that as a high calling.
Yeah, so what you're really saying is that that early generation was still drawing, if I may use the word, on Western civilization.
Yes, but
It also
sorry,
touches on religion because you spoke about the gods, but Mandela wasn't particularly religious, was he?
and yet I'll come back to that, but let me just explain my point because
Oh,
religion is
certainly.
these most of that generation were educated in church schools, good quality missionary schools. Some of their teachers were from Oxford, um, and at the university as well, Turflop University. So, and in fact, one of the worst things that happened under Milan was they closed the church schools because they wanted a uniformity of control of the curriculum. So your point about church is very important. Guys like Sisulu and Mandela and the others I mean, how would they have been so enthused with Shakespeare and English poetry and so on, if not because of the church schools? And that made a big difference. Now, as to his religion, Mandela's religion, there is a book that came out quite recently about his faith by a guy by the name of Kraybach, and I know him. And he argues that Mandela was in fact a Methodist and that he cared about his Methodism, but he never talked public. He did not believe, there were so many good things about Mandela. He did not believe his religion should become a club used as a stick. And so he kept it private. But this Kraybachen book, he's found that Mandela actually searched for he had a Methodist minister that he would consult from time to time, and he did care about those things. I didn't know about that all the time I knew him. I knew him not well, but I had quite a lot of contact with him. That never came up. I talked to him about things that are in my book, about this character Charlie Bloomberg, who was a
Yes.
friend of mine and also a friend of Mandela's. And when Mandela was in prison, Charlie would tell me all about Mandela. And then when Mandela came, but he died before Mandela was released. And so when he was released, I met him. I said, "Do you remember Charlie?" He said, "Oh yes, he was in the movement, and he was very nice." He said, "How is he?" And I had to tell him that he died. But they talked about Afrikaner nationalism and even theological questions. So I think he was. Methodism definitely meant something to him.
Oh, so
Uh,
you think it's a convincing thesis?
yes, but of course, he never spoke about it in public, and he would not allow it to be used in any way. Kept it private.
Yeah, but it would make sense with Fort Hare, and also thinking of Albert Luthuli with his wasn't he a Methodist minister?
Yes, and in fact, Oliver Tambo was a practicing and practicing Christian more openly than Mandela, and Tambo was his partner.
Oh, yeah, that's days back. I'm not sure how many of our listeners were even consciously alive when Mandela was president of South Africa, and let alone about the days when his picture wasn't allowed to be shown, but there was a sort of shadowy thing on the front page of the book or the cover.
No, no. When I grew up, I never knew what he looked like, and in fact, I was there the day he was released, and we were all dying to see what he looked like for the very first time, and we did. And in fact, a few weeks earlier, when we knew he was going to be released, one of the newspapers got an artist rendition assuming how he would look. And it was all over the newspapers, but it wasn't very accurate, we discovered once.
Yeah,
But the other thing, before we go off Mandela, I do want to say he really, I mean, I've known senators and ambassadors and presidents around the world. Mandela really was exceptional. When he spoke, he thought. He wasn't giving you sound bites. His worst public speeches, he had some terrible ones where he was reading a script because the ANC has this policy of, speeches by committee, and they're all terrible, and he read them terribly. But when he spoke from his heart, I was on the edge of my seat. I remember if I can take a moment on this, when you remember when Thabo Mbeki was president and he came out opposing antiretroviral medicine for AIDS. And this was actually a scandal in South Africa. You had the president of South Africa. People were dying of AIDS, and he was saying it's a virus, it's a syndrome, not a virus, and HIV doesn't cause AIDS, and all this denialism. And Mandela was now retired, but he felt so strongly about it that he felt he had to use his moral force. And he made a speech, but it had me on the edge of my seat because he said, he did it in a very thoughtful way. He said, President Mbeki is a very sharp man. He never speaks without studying a matter carefully. And then he slowly, so he gave him support, slowly building up to the fact that he's wrong on this damn issue and he better get his act together because our people are dying, But he did it so well. And also the other thing is, when the Iraq war was happening, Mandela was retired, but he called the White House. He wanted to talk to George Bush, and Bush wouldn't talk to him, put him onto the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and he was really annoyed. And he came out and he said he was really angry about that war, as I think was absolutely rightly. And he said he was really angry, and he probably wasn't as careful as usual. He definitely wasn't as careful as usual. He said, President Bush doesn't know how to think about these issues. And, so it goes back to the fact that he thought the task of a politician is to bring peace, to avoid war, to avoid, the destruction of human beings.
Did he ever have to exhibit the same kind of hatred as Winnie Mandela did? Like with Easter, we've got sufficient tires for more people to burn, and
no. Funny enough, you mentioned it. I've just been last week to a talk by Johnny Steinberg, who's produced a new book on Winnie and Nelson Mandela. And it's a very well worth reading. It's very well researched. It's 500 or 600 pages.
Wow.
And he talks about the fact that Winnie and Nelson were actually on opposite sides of a major dispute within the ANC movement on this issue, on the issue of peaceful change versus violent change. And according to Steinberg's thesis, Winnie believed, because of the way she'd been damaged, not necessarily from a rationally excusable, not at all from an excusable point of view, that the damage to her meant that she actually believed that there had to be bloodshed to be successful change. So it's a rather gruesome story. And she condemned Mandela for going the road of negotiation. It was a really serious rift between them.
Yes. Just quickly also tackling a bit, and then we get to the negotiations, Codesa and FW de Klerk, and then perhaps a little bit more Mandela, and then we have to analyze the 21st century and perhaps what is to come. You're still up to it? Then
yes, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, then we quickly go back to P.W. Botha. He was also called the big crocodile, the groot crocodile. Why was that?
Well, look, um, um, P.W. Botha was the first of the prime ministers who didn't go to university. Well, he went to university, but he dropped out from Free State University in, I think, his first or second year. He
Oh,
never, completed a degree. He was The story about him was that during World War II, these guys would break up political meetings with bicycle chains.
oh.
Um,
Of ze
and
waar brandwacht?
no.
Huh?
Funny enough, that's a distinction you can't make because Forster was also around, but P.W. Botha wasn't.
No.
But P.W. was considered. I don't know if you have the term in Dutch, a breker. A guy who was a tough guy.
Yeah.
Use his muscle. And so he entered politics as a party organizer. And you can imagine that kind of training. So he really didn't come out of any intellectual background, came about because he knew how to fight and he knew how to organize and he knew how to just drive the party to success. So, yeah, and he loved the military. He was Minister of Defense. And I mean, people saw his political behavior, even within the party, as a bit thuggish.
Oh, yeah. So he reached his position in the same way as he was helped out of it, because that was also more or less by force and a bit of health. But to me, it seemed that it was a very well organized move to sideline him, and he wasn't happy about it afterwards.
Well, yes, but the thing is, he'd had a stroke, and
Yeah.
so his health before. And what he did, which is fatal, we know from the ANC as well, he gave up the party leadership and tried to keep the presidency.
Yeah, so he was undermined organizationally.
But the new party leader, once elected, is a president in waiting,
Yeah,
and he's not going to want to wait. And then you had the fact that PW had a stroke,
yeah,
and he had made enemies. And FW, I mean, what helped FW de Klerk win the party leadership and therefore the presidency was that he came from the right of the party. When he came into power, he was considered a hardliner. I know, I
was
wrote a
he? Ah,
Oh, yes, definitely, most definitely. Because remember, he also in the old National Party, the power centers were the Transvaal Party, the Northern Party,
yeah, the
and the
caucus.
Cape Party, which was the Southern Party. And PW was leader of the Cape Party, and FW was leader of the Transvaal Northern Party. So those were the two main rivals. Remember, Connie Mulder, when he was going for the premiership, for the leadership, was leader of the Transvaal as well, and that's the bigger branch, bigger province. So FW and the Transvaal was more right wing than the Cape. So,
Yeah,
but of course,
yes,
ideology has different elements to it. But so in general, he was regarded as more right wing. That's how he got to be leader of the Transvaal National Party. And that was the route into becoming president, becoming party leader and therefore president.
yes. What would you say was the greatest challenge for him as he came into power in 1990? It was, wasn't it, or 89 already?
FW.
FW the Clerk, yes.
Well, I mean, I think it's beyond doubt. He took over from P.W. Botha. P.W. had met with Mandela, which was a monumental fact, but he couldn't cross the Rubicon. He couldn't go there. He couldn't accept the consequences of releasing Mandela. So when
Yes.
de Klerk became president, immediately the issue was the future of the country, which was wrapped up in unbanning the ANC and all the organizations, releasing Mandela and the political prisoners, and starting a negotiation. And what happened was when He had about 9 months while he was leader, but not president. And he used that time to travel the country and learn and listen. And the one thing, I mean, I knew both of them well enough. And the thing about PW is he never listened. He would walk up to you and tell you things,
Yeah,
and then he'd walk away.
Yeah.
F.W. de Klerk listened. The other thing is, PW always had a bit of a insecurity because he wasn't university educated. Most of the party leaders were, most of his colleagues were. But F.W. was from party aristocracy. His father had been a senator and a minister. His uncle was Stratham, the prime minister.
So there's that connection too. I didn't realize that.
Right. And F.W. de Klerk went to Potch University. He qualified as a lawyer, of course, qualified as a lawyer, and he became a lecturer and started an attorney's firm. And he'd been, as a member of National Party royalty, aristocracy, he'd been a leader all the way through his high school and university years. He'd been the head of the, of the National Party youth or whatever, and all of those things. So when FW was comfortable in his skin, I remember I used to go to these cocktail parties, even when, and PW, if PW came up to you, as I say, he'd talk and then he'd leave. F.W. de Klerk would come up and listen. He would be like anybody else. He'd be as long as you let him smoke. He was a big smoker. If he could smoke, he'd listen and he'd take it in, and he was open. So he was a very different kind of person. And what happened was the business community was absolutely, to an unprecedented historical degree, they all said to him, we can't carry on. We can't get investment. There's no money coming in. The economy is stuck. You have to negotiate. So I think that was one of the big factors, but there were obviously others. And he saw the trauma on the streets. And his intelligence reports were telling him very clearly. The intelligence people were saying to him, this cannot stand. We can't keep control. We're losing control. And where South Africa was extremely lucky was that he had the courage to face up to the reality of what that implied. Every other leader before him would ignore it. They just couldn't accept it.
Still, it was for some time. I lived in South Africa at the time. Around 94, it was really dicey with the commandos, the
AWB.
And General Viljoen, and then there was Eugene Terreblanche with his nonsense. It might have been civil war, but it didn't turn out that way. Why not?
Well, there's more than one answer to that, obviously. But the point I would make, I remember people saying to me, even in the 80s, the Afrikaner will never, look at the Anglo-Boer War, we fight, we will never give in. And I used to say, but they drive BMWs now. The Afrikaner of the late 80s had got an education, had got money in the bank, they had middle-class homes, and they drove very nice German-made cars. And people like that don't go to war so easily. It's very different from the old days.
Yeah.
That was the one thing. And then remember, if there was doubt about what I've just said, they lost in the 80s. They lost quite a lot of soldiers in Angola in the war, and Namibia and Angola. And within government circles, there was consternation. Parents were saying, this is not on. So I think you really were talking about a very different sociological group in the 80s that were in political power.
And would
In
you
the
say that that's true both of parents and the young generation at the time? Because there were journalists like Chris, I've forgotten his surname, but the one who wrote the book about Bootman, about FW's brother, the one who shot himself eventually years later.
oh, I don't know that one, but uh,
But
oh
did parents feel betrayed because of their kids senseless dying in Angola? And did that
well,
generation of people who went there feel the same, morally
well,
compromised,
well,
etc.?
I think there's just the appetite for war was very greatly reduced. But
Yeah.
the other thing, to answer your point about generations, is that by then, by the late 80s, the Afrikaans universities, including Stellenbosch, considered the sort of top university to some, if not to you, of Afrikanerdom. There were strong anti-apartheid movements on the campuses by then.
Yes.
Not the same as the English language universities, but there were. I mean, they all had contingents. There was a group of Stellenbosch University student leaders who flew to Mozambique to meet with the ANC, against the sharp disapproval of the government.
Yeah, and some went to Dakar at the time, even from Free State University, I think.
Yeah, but those I was in Dakar in that trip, but that was the older ones.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
under the new generation, there were many, and of course you did have journalists like Max Dupree and others who were very forcefully saying this is not defensible.
Mm.
But I really think the socioeconomic position of Afrikanerdom by then was really significant.
Uh, I recall reading Isaac de Villiers' book about his life, basically his autobiography. He used to be the editor of the newspaper you eagerly read, a report. Uh, One of the things that he regretted is that he helped to lie to his own people about the promises F.W. de Klerk and the National Party made about own schools, own areas, etc., that would be part of the new dispensation. Well, they knew that was not defensible and was never going to happen.
Well,
Uh, uh, what about truth and journalism in those days? Were the English speaking papers better, or was it just promoting the new thing as public relations for the new powers?
no, no, no. I mean, predominantly the English newspapers always had a different ethos. Look, in the apartheid days, coming out of the Milan years, they believe, when Milan was editor of Die Burger, and even till the end of apartheid, Die Burger was the official organ of the National Party.
Yes.
So they had a very different tradition. The English press considered themselves the more professional and objective. And while it was far from perfect, they were open to facts. They weren't particularly ANC at all. But there was a strong force within the English press that apartheid was wrong. They didn't necessarily want to go as far as what it would lead to, but there was the general ethos was that apartheid was wrong, and they would expose examples of that.
Yeah, so they would have had the same spirit as, say, Bishop Tutu, who was against abuses under apartheid and was as vehemently or worse opposed to abuses under the ANC, people who should have known better anyway. Uh,
Yes, but you raise a more subtle question. After 94, what happens. There's
Yes.
a huge change culturally in both cases. The Afrikaans press and News 24 and Naspers and so on have become high quality, educated journalists, professional standards, and so on, and quite, I would say, quite vigorous.
Oh, wonderful
Um,
to hear.
the
Yeah.
Afrikaans press papers,
Yes.
yes,
Yes.
yes, you would agree.
I think so. Yes. It could be
Now
a
the
lot worse. I think it's probably better than here in Europe.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, frankly, it's probably easier because the government doesn't, the government officials don't read it in
Oh,
Africa. But what,
yeah.
now the English press, something slightly different happened. First of all, in the early days of Mandela's presidency, people found it very hard to criticize him and his government. And I
Yes.
think that infected all the papers, certainly including the English papers, because, you know, he was such an icon. He was such an exceptional character. And also people were enthused with the idea of the Rainbow Nation and all of that stuff, the miracle and all of that. Um, and what's happened since then in the English press, unfortunately, is the main English papers in the Argus group were bought out first by an Irishman and then by a local black medical doctor, Iqbal Survey. And the papers have really gone downhill badly. They've taken an ideological line, which is, I would say, to summarize, probably sort of pro-Zuma line. But really haven't valued journalistic standards. And so most of those papers are on their way to extinction. It's very hard for papers to survive in any circumstance. On the good side, you know, I don't know if you've seen the website Daily Maverick.
Uh, I may have come across it.
Daily Maverick has been absolutely a game changer. It was started by a Serb who arrived in South Africa freeing Milosevic in the early 90s. And he has done he was a publisher in Serbia, very innovative. His name is Branko. And Branko came here, tried various different things, eventually started something called Daily Maverick, which is probably the most appreciated website in the country today. I think it's going downhill again now because he's retired, but they broke an enormous number of investigative reports on state capture, on Zuma and those people. They've done enormously good work, and they do have funding from some of the international and local foundations have funded, and in fact, there's an investigative team that's independent and is funded.
Yeah, it's wonderful that that sort of thing is happening because in some other countries, only investigative journalism into certain subjects and certain parties is allowed.
No,
Uh,
they've done very good. But the one other, you asked me a question I didn't properly answer earlier on, and what would fix journalism? What needs to happen, and there is evidence of it being attempted in countries like Australia, maybe to a degree in Europe, is that Google and Facebook, any social media or search engine that makes money out of journalism there has to be a requirement that they pay for it in some way. And Google is in negotiations with South Africa at the moment to do just that. Australia passed a law which is a start. It's not ideal, but it's a start. So people have realized, I mean, it's absurd that Google and Facebook make their money out of my journalism and they don't pay a cent for it.
yeah.
So that is the international move. I have more hope for Europe to move in that direction than the States. But the Australians and others are attempting it, and we are attempting it in South Africa.
Oh,
I'm not too. I can't say I'm too optimistic yet, but that's what needs to be supported.
yes, and if so, if enough people do it, then eventually your pressure comes to bear. But it's
I think you have to have legal you have to have legal authority.
yeah, and at least South Africa's constitution and the legal system uh, is at least accountable.
Yeah.
Still, some of my family are active there,
Ah,
and I was actually surprised how well it still did, and also some of the decisions of the Supreme Court in Bloemfontein in particular. That's not that's guided by law and
yes. Well,
not by politics, and that's a positive sign.
oh, definitely. Look, we have a very good constitution. And we have a pretty good constitutional court. We have some worries about it, but we have constitutional supremacy. The constitution is sovereign, not the parliament, and so that means that when the government passes a law, if the parliament passes a law, and it's questionable, it goes straight to the constitutional court, and they'll knock it down if appropriate.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah.
If um, if we look at the ANC years and its different presidents, as we are calling them from then on, we've talked about Mandela a bit, about Thabo Mbeki. What was the major shift in the Thabo Mbeki years
Um,
as compared to Mandela? There are also international economic factors that cannot be helped, but still.
No, Mbeki emphasized a different an ideological shift. Um, Although the ANC historically has not been black consciousness, he consciously promoted people from that movement and supported those ideas. Remember, he believed in the African Renaissance. And
Yeah.
so that had a racial tinge to it that never happened under Mandela.
And you also mentioned about under him uh, more pressure on journalism and objectivity emerging.
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I remember a group of journalists, including me, while he was president, we went to see him at his house to do an interview. And I remember feeling it was quite a strange experience. He wasn't warm or friendly to everybody. He knows me well. He had one or two favorites that he talked to in whispers on the side. Um, so, and I think that was relevant. Just not. It didn't give you the feeling that we're all South Africans together.
Yeah, yeah, not that straightforward openness that you would have had with some other leaders.
Oh, Mandela was extraordinary, and he was extraordinary to everybody. He would go and greet the cleaners and the kitchen workers. Had a
Yeah.
phenomenal memory for names and people.
Yeah, so that was also a personal difference between the two, plus the black consciousness, plus more ideological bias in
Funnily
government.
enough, on economic policy, uh, 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 Mbeki once called himself a Thatcherite.
And how was South Africa privatized or robbed?
Well, I think what he meant, it wasn't all bad because he did mean fiscal responsibility and fiscal restraint. Um,
Yeah, some people had some high hopes at the time because of that.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's still necessary because the ANC inherited a very, very large debt, very large deficit. The budget deficit in 1994 was about 9.3% of GDP, which, if you know economics, that's unsustainable. Most economists would consider 3% about a ceiling.
Yeah,
Um,
particularly if you're resting just on one or two sectors for
yeah.
that to make up for it.
Well, what had happened was the later years there hadn't been growth, but the security had been more and more expensive, and the Matisonn homeland system was costing more and more to have all these fake governments,
Yeah.
so-called black independent states that weren't really independent. So
So
Mbeki did well fiscally. Um, yeah.
And then I looked up on Wikipedia. Apparently, we had Montante for a few months too.
Yes,
He was born the
but he was
same
a
year as,
kid.
yeah.
He was actually a very sound president. When he made judicial appointments and so on, they were good appointments, very good appointments, and his cabinet was an improvement. But he understood himself to be a caretaker, and he wasn't trying to make new policy.
So was he? Why was he there at all?
Well, it was because of the way that Zuma ousted Mbeki. It was felt that he shouldn't, because there were clouds over Zuma, and so it was felt that he shouldn't come straight in immediately. So the compromise was to put Motlanthe in for the rest of the term, which was just
Uh,
a year and a
yes, but that's a foreboding. Eventually, Zuma came in first into your house uh, because that's what you tell us about in your book. That
That's right. Well,
your
yeah, he was in my house in the early 90s. When he first came back from exile, he stayed in my house for 2 months.
yes. So how was your big friend then and later in politics?
I wasn't there. I was overseas. Um,
It was just that your house was available and they asked you.
yes, and he still owes me the telephone bill.
Ah, so that had disappeared as you. Yeah, it's
No,
all online
anyway,
now.
that's by the by. But yeah, but of course he just turned out to be he he. In a way, you could compare him to PW in the sense, Witter, in the sense that he was the first ANC president who wasn't educated.
Yeah,
Um,
and as I looked from a distance, it seemed. Uh, you will have to correct me, but from a distance to me, it looked like okay, Inkatha is not going to win government with its Zulus nationally. So what are we going to do? We join the ANC and take over the party, and then we will rule everything. Is that close to truth, or should I see differently?
no, I think people exaggerate the importance of ethnicity
Hmm.
in the. I mean, it can rise again, and he is exploiting it in KwaZulu Natal at the moment with his
Yeah.
party. But no, the tradition in the ANC was to rotate it, and that's one reason why Mandela thought it was a good idea for Zuma because there'd been too many pauses.
Yes.
So thought it was time to have a Zuma. Um, no, yeah, but look, I think being Zulu helped him in his area, and he did particularly well in that province. But I wouldn't go so far as to say it was the sort
No.
of driving force for the country.
He just used it.
Oh, he used it. He used it as hard as he could.
Yeah, how was it possible for a politician like him to rise up in the ranks of a party like the ANC? What
Well,
allowed him to do it?
he was obviously very, very bright. He may be uneducated, but he's no fool.
Mm,
He's extremely charming, extremely personable, makes friends. He works 24-hour day as a day as a politician. He knows everybody. He makes his business to know everybody. And of course, he landed up head of intelligence in the ANC. And of course, that's a
yeah,
time-honored.
you're in the know-how.
Yeah, yeah. But then I think that my view is that felt Mbeki would often bring him in as his ally, as his second in command to meetings and so on, and eventually became his deputy president. I think Mbeki thought because he didn't have an education, he could safely use him without ever being at risk.
Uh-huh.
And that was, of course, a miscalculation.
A great one.
Very great.
Uh, if you summarize what Zuma did to South Africa, what would you say?
Oh, he did enormous damage. He hollowed out the government, governmental institutions, and the state companies, state-owned enterprises. he hollowed them out. He had a big effect on just damaging electricity, damaging the rail network, the ports, so many infrastructure areas, and the quality of governance in the cities and the towns is just awful. We haven't got over it.
Uh, this brings us, as well as the time probably, because you've been doing extremely well. It's almost a Joe Rogan experience here. Uh, but to analysis, looking back to the past, we've discussed leaders like Mandela, Malan, others, ideological shifts as well. Also within Afrikanerdom, people who first believed God and the Bible, but a very different situation in the Dutch Reformed Church, at least these days. Very different political circumstances. First question, as a theologian, would be: does God still play a role in South Africa?
I would say yes. Um, I would say the churches are not as forceful as they used to be in the time of Tutu and Busak and the others. But they do play a role, and they do play a positive role. The churches do speak out on moral issues. As I say, they don't. We don't have as forceful a leadership as we used to have, but they're still a good influence. So I think that's very positive. In the politics, funnily enough, some of the, I mean, the new parties, quite a few of the new parties are more openly religious. There's, of course, the African Christian Democratic Party.
Oh,
They've
so
been
they're still
around a
going.
while. Yes, they're still going. And some of these new parties, like I think the Patriotic Alliance, I think he's a couple of, and the Carter Freedom Front Party, I think they are relatively religious, as you know. They take account of religious discourse a little bit. Um, yeah, I suppose my concern is that it wasn't enough to stop them being corrupt.
Yes. The title of your book is Gold, Spies, and Lies. Let's take the lies first. Uh, After 8 or 9, what was it, Zuma years, now some years on with Ramaphosa, uh, what would you consider to be the biggest lies that still need solving in South Africa society presently?
um, I think the thing that most needs solving is not necessarily, well, the lie is that we're doing, you know, government, yes, government leaders at the highest level will say to you that we know we've been having difficult economic times, but it's because global trends are you know, the global economy is in such difficulty.
Yeah,
That's a
nobody
lie.
is responsible, really.
I mean, one, yeah,
Nobody's really responsible. It's
yes,
just other people.
yes. Now we know that's a lie. I say it's a lie, and I know it's a lie because we are doing, our economy and our unemployment rate are worse than all our neighbors.
Yeah,
And most of
I've seen the statistics. It's
right.
unimaginable. Like,
Obviously, we were a more sophisticated economy to start with, and we still are. But our growth rate is one of the lowest in the whole continent, and our unemployment rate is the highest in the continent. And that means if you read the economic data, you find that the South African growth rate pulls down the growth rate of the Southern Africa region.
yes, and I've seen education statistics
Yes, yes,
about that they do research on the average well, the IQ. That's some measurement of intelligence and the way people function, and South Africa's is one of the
I mean,
lowest in the civilized world. That's awful. It's not just normal, but it's
and and you know that we spend one of the highest per capita in the world. So we're spending money on education. We're just not getting the results. Um, I mean, one of the worst statistics is that the number of people after the fourth grade who can read for meaning is one of the lowest in the world.
yes, and that sort of extrapolate that to the future and thinking finding South Africa's future. Uh, we we don't need a totally gloomy scenario, and I'm looking to you for answers to find a positive future. How do we tackle some of those lies that we're being told? How do we get to truth? How do we uh, fix some of the major things that need fixing? Help us.
Well, my second book is addressed to exactly that.
Tell us about it. I haven't read it yet. I should,
It's
and I
it's
probably
called
will.
it's called Cyril's Choices, an agenda for reform.
I've
And
seen it on your LinkedIn page. Is it available on Amazon and
oh
Link
yes,
and
that's
Kindle, that sort
available
of thing?
anywhere. And in fact, it's now the price is greatly reduced. So it's not a big expense to buy it. And I studied since my days at the University of Chicago. Um,
Yes, you were
uh,
fellow there, weren't you, in
yeah,
public broadcasting?
yeah, for a year. But I used that time to understand how you get us back onto sound footing and get to growth. And if you look at the methods applied in Japan and China, people say they don't apply in Africa, but correctly done, they do applied, they do. And in fact, there are African countries who are applying them, adapted completely for local circumstances. And certain countries like Ethiopia had the fastest growth rate in the world for 10 years in a row, from '09 to 19 till there was a civil
Yeah.
war, which obviously.
And that next to Somalia. So apparently it's possible.
So it's definitely possible. Kenya's doing well. Countries that are applying the lessons and being and not over ideological. Deng Xiaoping, the great Chinese economic reformer, said it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it kills mice. Um, and South Africa professes to be very taken by China, but they're not listening to the great lessons that China used to bring 800 million people out of poverty.
Yeah,
So
that's
that's
the.
what my second book is about.
Do you've got solutions for politics and ethics too?
Well, yes. Well, as far as ethics can, I mean, I don't try to give theological answers. I'm not equipped to do that. But obviously the rule of law has to be put in place properly. We've let it really stray very badly. But I don't know that I could. I don't think I'm qualified to lecture you on ethics.
You could always try. I might pick up something, but uh, are there, because everyone has a perspective that might be helpful, are there some signs of hope that you're picking up?
Well, yes. Well, what we haven't talked about is that since July last year, to 2024, South Africa has a coalition government.
Yes.
Because the ANC did so badly. They've lost support so steadily and substantially that they were down to 40% at the last election, and they needed the Democratic Alliance with its 20% to rule. And they have a few smaller parties in as well. This is a hopeful sign. I'm not. I mean, I have a lot of concerns about it, but generally, I would say it is hopeful, and it does give the potential. We're really at an inflection point because Zuma's now got his own political party. They did fantastically well for a party that was less than a year old. They got 14.5%, and they took it mostly from the ANC. So there's a risk because I think if he took power, he'd do what he did last time. But if the coalition holds, and after the next election, some version of this coalition starts to take effect, we could see good improvements. Also, there's in about 18 months, no, end of next year, we're due for local elections, and because the governments in all the towns, the big towns except Cape Town, are performing so badly, I think that you'll see power change hands in quite a lot of the towns. So that's potentially really good because in Johannesburg, I own a flat there, and boy, you don't want to look at the state of the property market in Joburg. It's really depressing. And it's because the town is so badly managed. People are just getting out. But it has so many resources. It is the financial center of it's the most important financial center in the whole of Africa. And if they could just fix the roads and the electricity and the water and the street signs and so on, you could actually see substantial growth in South Africa.
That sort of thing usually starts at the personal level, and that's an area of ethics that you would have expertise on. Do you see signs of hope among people whom you meet that they really feel things should be different and willing to work for it and
Yes.
reflect that in their own lives? And if
Look,
more people are going to do it?
I think everybody thinks things should be different. The question is, as you say, how do you get to action? You are seeing signs of it. There are people who are getting together to fix their communities, to fix their streets and their gardens and their potholes. There are people who go around fixing the potholes. There are companies that are working on things like that in Johannesburg. So people are stepping in, and businesses stepping in. So people are seeing you cannot let this collapse. You've got to save it. And I think that movement will grow. I think as people figure out ways to do it, because of course you start off just leaving it to the government.
Yes, I think that's a terrific note to end our conversation for today. I advertise this book, and in the link I will also advertise your new book. Thank you so much, John, for talking to us and for the time that you were willing to spend with me. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Pleasure, Benno. Thanks for the time. I enjoyed it.